Hi class, welcome back. We're now on chapter 9, Black Pop, Reggae, and the Rise of Disco. Now, the 1970s, very unique decade like I talked about in the last video. And we think about some of those events that have made an impact in our life, even if we didn't live through them. The Apollo 13 mission, remember that movie? Or how about the first jumbo jet, the Boeing 747? That changes commercial air travel forever. The environmental. The first Earth Day is introduced, as well as, on the federal government side, the introduction of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is introduced. Also government-wise, we have the voting ages lowered from 21 to 18. And the computing side, IBM creates the first floppy disk. Motorola introduces the Dynatac 8000, which is essentially the first cell phone, right? And it also originated on a beach in Miami in 1949 with a guy drawing these bars, thinking about Morse code when he was in the Boy Scouts, that later turns into the UPC code, which is first introduced and used in 1974 to sell and scan a pack of Wrigley's gum, which is actually in the Smithsonian Institute today. The Post-it note is introduced, Rubik's Cube. The push-through can tab, if you remember those pull cans, I actually remember those. The first digital camera is introduced by Kodak. The MRI machine, changing how we scan in medicine. And also to do with music, we'll talk about the UPC code in a minute, the Sony Walkman. So if you think about all these elements and the decade that they're living in, it's ready to shape what's going to become the 1980s, the same way the 60s did for this decade. And we see the UPC code is going to be important for business, for tracking record sales. And we're going to see that later. Why is that important? Because before, what you had to do is you had to wait to get your sales from the record stores. And then now with a UPC, you're going to be able to receive those in real time. We'll talk a little more about that when we move on to the 1980s. But let's talk about some of these artists, especially from this period. Now, Sly and the Family Stone. It can't be stated enough actually how influential this group was on a variety of levels. First of all, we talked on the end, jazz fusion artists like Miles Davis, right? Guys that were standard jazz musicians, then all of a sudden decided to get into implementing rock and funk into improvisatory music. Where did this idea come from? Well, we know that he saw Sly Stone playing at the 1969 Newport Jazz Festival. Now, it wasn't just an artistic, again, I always tell people, if there's something artistic involved, they want a monetary change as well. But Miles Davis, always being the hipster that he was, wanted to find a way to connect with youth again like he had done before. And he saw the reaction he was getting from Sly Stone's band to the audience. So that helped influence his 1970 record, Bitches Brew, which is the first jazz fusion record. Okay, so, and understanding too that Sly Stone, it wasn't just the band and that music then. Other groups popped up around. He had a bunch of horn players. He was also a fully integrated band. We'll see other bands like from Oakland, Tower of Power, bringing that rock and funk sound. Later, we'll see that horn sound influencing pop R&B bands like Earth, Wind & Fire, Ohio Players, and even ones from Fort Lauderdale, part of the disco period, KC and the Sunshine Band. Right, so that horn sound becomes a huge influence in the 1970s in pop and funk music, right? Now, other guys, we think about record labels that we had heard before, especially through the 1960s, more specifically Motown Records. Now, Motown, remember, was originally Motor City, Berry Gordy's record label. Now, he wound up making the move to Los Angeles, and he wanted to be closer to that pop arena. Some of the artists went with him. The band, unfortunately, remember I mentioned before, the Funk Brothers, they did not. So now they fast forward, they go out to LA. And artists like Marvin Gaye, right? And he had been through a lot. So we think about Marvin Gaye, one of the larger artists on Motown at that time. Actually, originally started as a Motown drummer as well, playing drums for the Supremes, if you can believe that. Now, a couple other maybe little facts about Marvin Gaye that most people don't know is his last name, Gaye, didn't always have the letter E in it. There was a lot of gay rumors and he wanted to dispel those, so he added an E. He also had a tumultuous relationship with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., so he put the E, also helped. Unfortunately, as we'll see later in his life, Marvin Gaye winds up actually being killed by his father by a gunshot after an argument in the family house. Now, what was going on with Berry Gordy? If you remember before that it was black artists playing for white audiences, right? That was kind of the model, the Brill Building model. He also tried to stay away all through the 1960s, right? Berry Gordy made sure his artists stayed away from anything that would be seen political or anti-establishment. He didn't want to cause any waves. There's a lot of artists would get backlash for those things. Now, with the release of his album, What's Going On, he enters into that arena. Empowerment and talking about social strife, the war, environmentalism. And if you know the song, What's Going On? So I encourage you to check out the lyrics. This was a complete departure. As a matter of fact, Berry Gordy did not want to do that song or the record. It's also the very first black concept album. Just like the Beatles had theirs with Sgt. Pepper, Lonely Heart Club Band, this is the first full concept record from beginning to end from a black artist. Other artists coming off that Motown. We have Stevie Wonder, right? Now, a couple things about Stevie Wonder. The reason he's blind, he wasn't born that way. It's actually too much oxygen in an incubator. He was also the youngest solo artist to win a #1 Billboard spot back in the 60s on Motown when they were in Detroit for the song Fingertips, right? Now, other artists, now also back with Stevie Wonder actually was also a spearhead artist in using synthesizers. And it was him that almost single-handedly helped popularize the Moog synth in pop music. Now, moving down to Memphis, Stax Records, right? So before that, if you remember going through Stax Records, their big artist was Otis Redding. And Otis Redding, also unfortunately in 1967, dying in a plane crash. And his last song, which was released posthumously actually, was Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. So after that, Stax was in a bit of disarray. They needed a new artist. Well, one of the people that played piano for their band and sometimes songwriter for Stax as well, including songs like Hold On, I'm Coming, is Isaac Hayes. Some might know him from South Park as a chef for many years. But he was also part of the movement of blaxploitation, which was big in the 1970s. Blackula, and the one that he was involved writing the soundtrack for, Shaft, the movie Shaft, right? You can always remember the line, you can see the cat is a bed, you better shut your mouth, right? All funk, all attitude. Again, also still very different from Motown. Now, a couple of other elements you're going to see in this chapter. Reggae. Now, reggae, of course, coming from Jamaica, but Jamaica had a direct connection to the UK. And of course, when we think about reggae, most people just think of who but Bob Marley, right? Now, he was popular in the UK, and it wasn't until a UK artist who was popular in the US, a guy named Eric Clapton, covers a Bob Marley song called You Shot the Sheriff, right? So after Shot the Sheriff is covered by Clapton, then all of a sudden Clapton fans start looking into Marley. And then that brings his popularity to the United States. One last thing to know about Marley, unfortunately, with his death, is he wound up dying, actually here in Miami, in 1981 of cancer. He was a Rastafarian. So when he was first found with cancer several years before that, he refused full treatment because apparently it was against the Rastafarian religion. So, now, just to reiterate, everything here in the 1970s and all the inventions I just talked about before, Sony Walkman, which we'll talk about later, and the UPC code are going to have a huge influence as we get into the 1980s. We're also going to have to move into those other song styles which we mentioned, disco. We're going to have disco and punk, and I'll talk about their unique relationship in the next chapter in the next video. So until then, you guys take care, be safe.